Welcome back, everybody. I'm Stephen Woodhouse from Pöyry's, actually from the Oxford office of Pöyry. I've been with the company for 14 years and I lead our work in market design. So over the years I have been involved in projects which remove capacity payments and introduce energy-only markets. I've also been involved in projects where I've written even the detailed algebra for implementing capacity payments. Again, over those years I've been on panels arguing the need for capacity payments, and nowadays I would argue that energy-only markets don't work and capacity payments are only a partial fix and there are better solutions. So that capacity payments might look like a quick answer, but they probably cause more difficulties than they solve. So let me take you on a journey. So this is a brief description of the company. Pöyry, as the Finnish parent would pronounce it, is an engineering consultancy, but I live in the management consulting world. Our energy management consulting team is around 250 people, predominantly in Europe, but like our clients, we've also gone overseas. We're in the Middle East, South and Central America, as well as a number of interesting places in Southeast Asia. So I think that's the future of a lot of the companies in our business. I'll cover 3 points. Why do we need flexibility, and why is there an increasing need for flexibility? And why do the current incentives for flexible capacity not meet the market's needs? And then some suggestions on the ways forward. Now, before we get into the detail, I'll ask some questions about what a capacity payment should do. Capacity payments should, if they're designed properly, fulfill a number of requirements. And I don't think any of them actually do all of these, which is one reason why they fail. So the first requirement of a capacity payment is that if you need new capacity, you can make it arrive. Now, there are lots of ways to do that. There are lots of ways of throwing money at new projects. And in Europe, I think we've tried them all. But that's one of the things you need a capacity payment to do when capacity is needed. Another thing you need capacity payment to do is to be brave enough to pay the old capacity the same as the new capacity, provided it's delivering the same service. Many of the schemes that we see are not brave enough, and we don't pay the same to old generation as to new, and I could give you lots of examples. But then we get into the interesting things. You need the demand side, and I think that's critical in the future, that you need the demand side to have access to the same terms, and generally capacity mechanisms are all about reliability, and they tend to preclude demand involvement. You need customers to see that in particular hours, there is a very high price and a very sharp scarcity. Most capacity payments do not have hourly or half-hourly values. And because of that, they also fail on the next requirement, that you deliver the right signals for cross-border trading, both in the short term and also in long-term investment signals. Most capacity payments simply fail on that score because they don't attempt to allocate a dynamic price. And in the end, what you end up with with a capacity payment is two things. Firstly, that if you do not place strong requirements on capability to deliver, we find megawatts are cheap. So most of the US markets where we have organized capacity payments have been clearing at the floor price because demand response is very capable of delivering that narrow service. Now, the other issue that we find with capacity payments is you end up with a vast amount of regulatory risk. So the scheme in Ireland was designed to provide a long-term signal, so to provide a long-term scarcity price even if there's overcapacity, but the regulator had a very easy lever to pull, which says pull here to bring prices down, and they've knocked 20 or 25% out of the capacity payment simply for political purposes. So the regulatory risk with capacity payments is actually rather great. So I'll go very quickly through this. This is now familiar territory. Some of these results are from some of our earlier studies on the impact of wind intermittency. So we see vastly more, let's call it autonomous generation coming onto the system, which runs when the weather dictates rather than in any kind of merit order calculation. We have several ways of solving the, let's call it the intermittency problem. Flexibility from the generation fleet, which must include the renewables themselves, more interconnection, demand response,
And finally, storage. Now, for me, with the exception of pump storage, storage is probably science fiction, or it's at least economic fiction. Demand response, there is fantastic potential for demand response, but it requires a high degree of customer engagement, and I'm not convinced we're going to get there quickly. It only works with either the larger industries or at the domestic level in heating and hot water and hopefully electric vehicles. So I think this is somewhere in the future, at least as a solution to intermittency. Interconnection, well, you have two problems with wind. Too much wind when you don't need it, and for sure interconnection helps with that. And the other problem is not enough wind or not enough sun when you do need it. Now, interconnection doesn't help with that problem. We've found in the studies we've done that over vast periods of parts of Europe at the same time, you can get low wind. And we all know when the system peak is, and it isn't very sunny then either. So really it comes down to flexibility from the generation fleet as being one of the primary drivers to solve the intermittency issue. And in another study, we've looked at the long-term prospects for decarbonisation. I won't go into the detail, except if you look at the carbon price that's required in a market environment to decarbonise, the blue dot here is around the 200, 250 mark. If there isn't, that assumed a lot of demand flexibility, in fact, in the fleet, a lot of demand-side management. If you don't have enough demand-side management, but really if you don't have enough flexibility in the fleet, the 250 figure goes up way above 300. So on a very simple metric, you cannot decarbonise in a cost-effective way unless we get a lot more flexibility into the fleet than we have today. But we're not paying for flexibility. Instead, we're designing capacity payment schemes, and they're sprouting up like weeds across Europe. And the impact they will have on cross-border trading is extremely damaging. The Commission is now very well aware of this and is trying to solve the problem. But it's a bit unfortunate that the first real documents that the Commission put out talking about capacity payments were in the context of 2050. And you might argue they were a year or two too late in thinking about that. So they're trying to put the genie back in the bottle. So some questions about how we should be rewarding flexible capacity. Well, before you answer those questions, you have to answer the fundamentals. Do we know what the requirement is for flexibility? And the answer is no. We don't know what the flexibility needs will be in 5 and 10 years' time. We're about to roll out smart meters. Maybe that will do something to the patterns and the flexibility of demand. We certainly don't know it for now. So to set in place long-term schemes which say, I know what capacity you need, here is the money for this class of capacity, that seems to be pretending we know more than we actually do. We should be looking at who should be buying the capacity, and ultimately it's the people who need flexibility, which is in part the renewable generators themselves who need flexibility to back their own portfolio. If you look at capacity payments, we risk paying for the wrong technology. The UK is a case in point where we're saying that there will always be 4 hours warning before a system event, before the penalties for capacity payments kick in. And I see that as a big regulatory risk for the future when it turns out we don't always get 4 hours warning. And finally, how flexibility can be traded across borders. And the target model is supposed to be about exactly that. It seems to have been distorted into how can we get the day ahead working, and we won't think about intraday and flexibility at all. That's an afterthought. So I'll skip over some of this. The current incentives for flexibility fall short. Where does the money come from for being flexible? So one solution is that you get price spikes and short-term, scarcity value for the very flexible plants, and that's a very volatile stream of revenue. Another way might be through selling services to the system operators through the balancing mechanism, or maybe through some specific, let's say, reserve contracts. And again, in some markets, you get capacity mechanisms. Now, what we find is that imbalance generally is subsidized one way or another, that the people who really should be facing imbalance risk are sheltered from it and are not exposed to those risks. So, of course, there's no value for flexibility because the people who need it most don't need to pay for it. And instead, flexibility is paid for by the single buyer, the monopsony, so it's the reverse of a monopoly buyer. So it's no great surprise that we're not seeing value for flexibility in the markets, because there are no markets for flexibility. So again, I'll skip forward. We are now running a project which has 19 clients from across Europe. It's become a bit of a bandwagon. We've got 3 regulators, several TSOs, some service providers, a power exchange, and utilities from absolutely across Europe with different types of technology, trying to find a market-based solution to these issues. We had a debate in Eurelectric about 12 months ago. Amongst other things, people found that the key missing market was flexibility. And in fact, in the context of the project we were doing, we rerun this discussion just last week and got exactly the same answers to the same questions. The percentages were slightly different, but again, people felt a flexibility market was the key missing market, not a capacity market. And this is the philosophy of the study. We are trying to find the most economically efficient way of, let's say, meeting the European goals for decarbonisation and security of supply, so that's just our 3 pillars, through signals and behavioural incentives for all market participants, so that includes renewables, based on market values for all services, and the method is by simultaneous optimization across the timeframes. So I'll explain that. The target model is about cross-border trading, starting with the day-ahead stage. So effectively, we have an optimization at the day-ahead stage, and if there's any capacity left over across the borders for intraday, then the intraday picks up anything that's left over. What we need is co-optimization across all of the time frames. And the best example of this is the link between Norway and the Netherlands, and the prospects for a link between Norway and GB, which probably won't get built if some of these things don't happen. So day ahead, what will happen? We have some capacity between Norway and the Netherlands, and we find that day ahead there can be even a very small spread between the markets, and you will fill up the interconnector capacity. And the places you get lots of flexibility are also the places you get cheap energy. It's the hydro-based systems. So day ahead, we will always fill up the interconnector between Norway and the Netherlands, however small the arbitrage is. So the Netherlands will be a thermal system with quite high impact of intermittency, a lot of need for flexibility within day, and the best source of that flexibility, I'm sorry, we foreclosed that market. We've wasted the interconnector capacity on something that doesn't allow flexibility, and then the flexibility can no longer be traded across borders. So the value of that interconnector, the real value is that you can move flexibility around the system. Institutionally, it's being locked out. And because of that reason, the link to GB will never get built from Norway. So time is short. I won't go into the full details of the study, but essentially the areas we are looking at are requiring balanced responsibility for all parties and having marginal balancing prices, so fully marginal balancing and imbalanced prices, so people really value flexibility. Secondly, that we develop trading of energy options, so people can buy an option against price spikes, so the flexible generators, instead of living on very short-term streams of revenue, they can sell options long-term. So this is the substitute for a capacity mechanism. It's a market-based mechanism. So capacity in this sense is an option to deliver energy. We need then to allow capacity on the interconnectors to be allocated based on the value both of the energy arbitrage and the option arbitrage, or perhaps explicit capacity products. We can talk about that. During the time frames from day ahead through intraday to balancing, rather than having an ex-ante reservation of capacity which says day ahead gets 100% first come, first served. That's surely the wrong answer. And we then move to cross-border balancing. And just to pick up one of the points that was discussed earlier today, our view is that the concept of common merit orders for standard balancing products is simply unworkable, And instead, we need to allow innovation to work. We need to allow the market providers to define their capabilities instead of the TSOs defining their requirements in a series of narrow boxes, which will look remarkably like the things that steam turbines can achieve. So that's a very high-level description of what we're trying to achieve. The study's coming to a close with a final workshop in early December, and I'd be happy to talk about the details, probably privately later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. One thing before we move on. Do you think this market-based solution, like the options, do give enough incentives also for long-term investment decision? I mean, because this long-term investment incentives seem to be the main driver for current discussions about capacity mechanisms. So I ask you whether these market-based solutions do give enough incentives for longer-term decisions.
I don't have it here. One of the other pairs of questions we asked at this event last year and the same event last week was, firstly, can market participants accept the market risk associated with building a CCGT? And to my surprise, most of them said yes. And we asked a separate question, can market participants face the regulatory risk associated with building a CCGT under a capacity payment? And last year, the vast majority of people said no, they could not accept the regulatory risk associated with capacity payments to support CCGT. Capacity payments, whatever people pretend, are not long-term. They might be long-term enough that you can get through your project finance, but good luck getting to the end of your debt term under the capacity payment. So ultimately, I think unless you have a market-based instrument, you don't have the certainty you need for a long-term investment signal. So surely when we privatized the industry, I think the UK was probably one of the first in Europe to privatize, 1990, we had a capacity payment scheme then. But in the early days, nobody built on an expectation of market prices. They built on long-term contracts, and that was the only thing you could take to a bank. It took about 3 years before people were prepared to take merchant risk based on forecasts of the power prices. And of course, that's one of the reasons companies like mine exist. So I do believe that there will be a future where you can bank investments on the optionality. And if you can monetize the options, it's then a much less prone to regulation stream of value. So it's much more robust in the long term. You might find, though, that we don't have a shortage of capacity just at the moment. So I don't think any capacity payment scheme will hide that fact.